This video is part 2 of a 2-part series. Well, howdy there. Did you miss me at all? Well, don't despair, as I'm coming back at you with part 2 of my History of Mendocino County series. We left off on one of the most brutal family feuds in Northern Californian history, so let's see how that ends along with the evolution of Mendocino County up to the modern day. Now, if you haven't seen part 1, you'll find a link in the description below, and I highly recommend watching that one before this one. Don't worry, I'll be right here waiting for you. Either way, without further ado, I am your favorite hobby historian, Mr. Minarchist. Let's finish the tale of Mendocino County in all its glory. Going back to the Coates-Frost family feud, tensions, as tensions tend to do, were rising. Now, at first their anger only flared up in the form of the occasional saloon brawl, or good old-fashioned vandalism of each other's property. However, that would soon change come election night in the October of 1867. A brawl between the young men of both families would go on to escalate into a full shootout in front of Old Man Bechtel's store on Main Street. It was 3 against 4 in the Frost's favor, but it would leave 3 Coatesmen and 1 Frostman dead, while the 3 remaining Frosts scarpered away, badly injured. By the time the smoke had cleared, first blood had been drawn, and the Coates family were understandably furious and had organized a manhunt for the perpetrators. As the town broke down into chaos and even the sheriff losing all control, the Coates had made for the Frost family ranch.
Get down here now, you inbred trash!
What happened next is unfortunately blurry, as accounts of the rest of the night wildly differ. What is known is that the Frost property was left a smoldering ruin, but there were no reports of any more deaths that evening. Later, throughout the following year, the Frosts were slowly meeting their ruin at the hands of the Coates, culminating in one of the surviving Frostmen from the Election Day shootout being found lynched on Sherwood Road. Eventually, the Frosts would move down to the next stagecoach stop, the town of Laytonville, where I grew up, actually. Not much is known about the feud's end, and most of this is, unfortunately, conjecture. What is indisputable, though, is that several from both families did not outlive the conflict, and that the Frosts were left with no choice but to go north. With no clear victor in sight, the feud would eventually die out, and the town that would become Willits, California, would largely carry on, leaving the dead in the local cemetery. Soon after, most of the townspeople would forget about the feud, and the scars on the town would eventually fade, most going about their own business, pretty much as they'd always had. Now, of course, the story of the Coates-Frost family feud seems tailor-made for the backdrop of the old Wild West.
Shootout! Like a western.
Yes, like a western. However, tales befitting a Clint Eastwood film weren't exactly commonplace, not even for Mendocino County, with the feud really being the only hot point in our history, along with a British gentleman bandit known as Black Bart moseying through and robbing stagecoaches in the area for a few months. Yes, for most of our county's history, it was as humdrum as even the most remote western locations usually tended to be. And from 1850 onwards for Mendocino County, it really was a time of growth. Redwood mills were growing, and thus the population was growing, and when the population and industry grow, so do the settlements. At this point, Mendocino truly was the frontier, and it wasn't very desirable during the heights of the gold rush as there wasn't really much yield.
fairy dust. It doesn't exist. It's never landed.
And it was because of this fact that all rail lines stopped to our south in the city of Petaluma. But north of Petaluma, there were only wagons and stagecoaches that would venture up there. And before the events of the Mendocino War, without free farming and ranching land, Mendocino County was, well, difficult for settlers to justify living in.
Just hear me out, please!
However, once the war was finally over and the land suddenly became, free, things were finally looking up for Mendocino County approaching the 1870s. The city of Ukiah, obviously being the county seat, was the first settlement to grow, and the first Anglo settlers in the area would be only a few vaqueros employed by Mexican cattle companies of the 1840s in Alto, California. But by the 1850s, a gentleman by the name of Perkins would settle a large portion of land, and thus Ukiah was on the map.
Message, like location, I'm gonna come. Whatever you want, doesn't matter.
Yet another pioneer, Hiram Willits, would go on to found the town of Little Lake in the 1850s, which 40 years later would bear his name. And in the 1860s, a blacksmith named Francis Layton would found Laytonville. Meanwhile, towards the coast, before the rail lines expanded, the only way to transport our massive redwood lumber yield was through the Noyo Harbor, just south of the town of Westport, and a military installation that would later become itself a town, Fort Bragg, and the town of Hopland, named for the hops that were cultivated there, which would suffer a blight that made hops essentially impossible to grow, leading to its contributing to California's future but now famous wine industry. And of course, the aforementioned in my first video, Nome Colt Farm, in which many natives were interred by the end of the Mendocino War in the 1850s in the Round Valley region, would go on to become the town of Covelo. Well, dear viewer, you may have noticed that a lack of railroads in Mendocino County has been a bit of a recurring theme, but that would finally go on to change in the year of 1885 with the introduction of the California Western Railroad, or CWR, and it was cause for celebration as Mendocino County and its residents were finally catching up with the rest of the state.
Hell yeah! Hey, come on, baby! Come on! Yes! Come on! Ah! Yes! Yes!
However, the denizens of Mendocino County weren't used to the smell of burning coal fumes unless they worked in the logging industry, and to them, these fancy newfangled locomotives were quite pungent, with many remarking as the trains passed, you could smell them before you could see them, and often referring to them as skunks, and so the CWR would go on to be called the skunk train, and well, it still is. But moving on, well past the 1800s, the Wild West died out, and Mendocino was quick to welcome the 20th century. To the north, golf courses and other such luxuries were becoming available for well-to-do East Coasters to enjoy, with coastline tourism increasing as well.
Sure, I could just take my winters in my country club in California.
The United States victory in the First World War would be celebrated with the opening of the Victory Theater in Ukiah. The Roaring Twenties came roaring in and grinded to an end. The Great Depression would go on to slam Mendocino County's economy, and America's entry into the Second World War would revitalize it. And so, by 1949, the biggest lumber mill boom would shake all of Northern California, and of course, Mendocino County is a part of that. And from 1949 to 2006, these mills would be the lifeblood of all of the county. Yes, the times sure were a-changing after the Summer of Love, and in the late 60s and throughout the 70s, Mendocino County was no exception. The Back to the Land movement swept through as beatniks, hippies, and other such counterculturalists left their urban environments in search of Mother Nature, and they immediately took a liking to Mendocino County. However, very few would find a particularly warm welcome in Mendocino County at first, as it was comprised mainly by those in the logging industry with the tolerance of Archie Bunker.
Here, man, I'm so high.
Get hippie!
Whoa, dude,
Get out of here!
not cool. What's up?
However, this would eventually lead to a complete overhaul of Mendocino County's culture entirely, as we refer to ourselves as the home of the redneck hippie. Mainly because it turned out Mendocino's climate was hospitable to a different kind of cash crop entirely. Now, for most of us Mendocinoians, for most of us people from Mendocino, getting a high school job or even pursuing a career in one's local sawmill was seen as something as a rite of passage. Most people just figured it paid the bills, and it was what their folks did. I mean, my mom and dad worked at the Harwood sawmill in the small town of Branscombe, in between Laytonville and the coast. And that's just one example of one mill out of many operating in the area, and it had been the case for many generations past. However, in 1994, President Bill Clinton had signed the North American Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, allowing for cheaper Canadian lumber to flood the market, and whereas the Northern Californian sawmills were of course all in competition, they were more or less in balance. This was, however, uprooted. Just one example of the dumpster fire that was NAFTA backfiring on us. Either way, this resulted in most sawmills going under, Harwood Products included, and any sawmill that survived only did so through massive corporate backing, leaving behind husks of Mendocino County's former self. I mean, seriously, look at that. Pripyat is in better shape. With massive layoffs hitting the entire county, it left many areas with little choice but to look elsewhere for gainful opportunity. So remember when I said that there was another cash crop in town? Yeah, well, it wasn't always exactly legal. Marijuana from Humboldt, Trinity, and Mendocino counties was praised for its potency, quality, and uniqueness. It was world famous amongst avid stoners, and it was high in demand and short in supply. Couple that with rising unemployment, and you essentially have the Prohibition bootlegging era in the early 21st century. In some cases, people were making more money than they ever had before, and the pain of losing their jobs was supplanted by success. And, well, the occasional arrest. And that was really their only obstacle, that pesky law enforcement. But despite law enforcement's best efforts, those who get their peaches down in Georgia will always get their weed from California. They'd bust a farm, and 2 more popped up in its place. However, in recent years, California voters would be faced with Proposition 64, legalizing the use, cultivation, and sale of marijuana entirely. Those in Mendocino were thrilled. Finally, they could maximize profits and not get arrested. However, to their surprise, so could everyone. The Emerald Triangle's market was flooded, and soon its lucrative nature was less so. Sure, state-sanctioned farms were fine, but all in all, the glory days were over. So, what's next for Mendocino County? Well, we'll just have to wait and see. I hope you enjoyed the tale of Mendocino County, and if you did, drop a like or a comment down there. I've been Mr. Minarchist, and I'm, out of time. So, it's a big, big world out there. Head on a swivel, you get the drill.